So the first thing that comes to mind, though, when you think about that, is not just the offensive end either, Derek. It's the defensive side of the ball because of how important he is defensively. We know who he is as an offensive player, dropping 30 a game, 30 plus over the last couple of seasons, leading the league in scoring, etc. We got all of that, but it's the defensive side too. And Paul Reed being on the floor, Mo Bamba being on the floor this past season, Andre Drummond a few years ago. Now he's back, as you talked about him. You need to also have people who are on coming off the bench and who's on the floor with him that can defend that end of the floor and make sure that those numbers are not just being run up in a big number simply because Joel Embiid is off the floor and anchoring the backside of that defense and speaking and talking and being vocal about what's going on the defensive end and cleaning up anything that gets past the first line of defense down to where, the painted area is for where he is. And that defense is really important in making sure that that plus minus, that 8 points difference, that 16-point swing that you talk about is not something that's really as defined as we talk about here because he's off the floor. So as much as we speak about how important the points are, we know that the offensive hub, he is it. And it starts with him, doesn't always end with him anymore because of how good Tyrese Maxey is in the addition of Paul George. But that defense is important. So when you mentioned Tyrese Maxey being on the floor, Paul George still being hopefully a plus defender on that perimeter, now having Andre Drummond on the back end and whomever else is on the floor with him, whether it's KJ Martin, Eric Gordon, Ricky Council at the wing position, maybe Kelly Oubre is on the floor also coming back in that substitution pattern. Whoever it is out there on the floor has to be able to defend the floor. And then plus, as we talk so much about the defensive part of the defense we know is also the rebounding. You have to secure those rebounds so you don't get those extra opportunities to get that second chance points, to put those points on the board, to make it to everything you just laid out, that +8 and that 16-point turnaround because Joel Embiid is not on the floor. So if they're able to do that and sustain that at a much better number, and at this rate, you're just looking at +1. Can you just have a +1 when he's off the floor so you don't lose much ground when he takes a seat? So it doesn't look so bad as we talk about it because we all know it. It's his mindset of he has to get back on the floor. Now Nick Nurse has to change the substitution pattern, get him back on the floor quickly so things don't get too far out of hand and make it look as bad as possible. And then when you go to the offensive side, we've seen so much now with Tyrese Maxey anchoring that non-Embiid lineup. In the past with Tobias Harris out there on the floor, or he and James Harden out there on the floor together. But more specifically this past season, since Tyrese had elevated his offensive production and Tobias Harris being there, now you have Paul George. So with those two carrying that, maybe with someone like Eric Gordon on the floor, taking those outside shots, getting the ball to drop, Kyle Lowry on the floor, as you talked about, setting up Maxey and Paul George as well, and just being a smart, crafty veteran player who knows how to run a team, get his buckets when need be, even get us to the free throw line. That we know points matter, so the points matter. No matter how you get them, you just get them and make sure that, again, it's not a lopsided thing when Joel Embiid is off the floor. So with now knowing who Tyrese Maxey is as a scorer, he's already seen all these defensive lineups. We've seen all these defensive coverages that come after him, trying to take the ball out of his hands. We all remember, give the ball back, get the ball back, Tyrese, go back and get it, because you can't just give it up and expect somebody else to go generate something that's not there for them. Have to go get the basketball. We know he can score and carry and anchor and lead. And we talked about Jamal Murray yesterday and speaking about when Nikola Jokic is off the floor. We've seen a lot of times when we were discussing the playoff run, the championship performance that they had, Jamal Murray, the times where he's really going nuts on the floor when Nikola Jokic is off of because of his scoring ability. That's where we are going to look for heavily in seeing a Tyrese Maxey and now even Paul George can make sure that they do that part when Joel is off the floor.
And that is a big part of why, where I started was with Tyrese and whether or not you could trust him, not trust him, but whether or not you think you don't need to sacrifice, a little bit of defense to get more playmaking on, because if you do, then you can get your better perimeter playmakers or better perimeter defenders on the floor. You mentioned, defense. That is, I think, a very key part of this. When you have Maxey and Paul George on the floor, as long as you have enough shooting, you should be able to remain competitive defensively. The goal is to not make too many sacrifices defensively Andre Drummond will obviously help with the rebounding. He is not necessarily the greatest interior defender. He does not alter shots at the rim like Joel Embiid. Few do, but Andre does not, despite his size. So denying dribble penetration is going to be key. And if you can put your better, Kelly, Martin, obviously, even Ricky Council, if he develops enough, if you can put them on the floor, that's going to be less of a concern. So I do think a lot of this goes back to Tyrese. I hate putting so much on the shoulders of is he 23 or 24 at this point?
I think he's still 23.
I think he's 23. It does.
Yeah, I think
I hate putting that much
He's
pressure
a young guy.
on a young kid. But if he can make that next leap, and I know he's talked about it. He talked about last year being the first year that he was really running point guard full time and running an offense full time. If he can make yet another leap, that just makes everything easier. So that is sort of why I started there. I do think, Andre Drummond, he is someone who, if you look, I think he's only played like a grand total of 17 playoff games over the course of his NBA career. He's only been in the playoffs 4 times. I think all of those were just first round. He does not have a lot of playoff experience. His archetype in terms of not moving well in space tends to not translate all that well to the playoffs. So I do think there is still a little bit of uncertainty over what he can give you in the playoffs. So that is sort of like my second key. And it's sort of no surprise that the key, especially when you think, all right, Maxey and Paul George have it enough offensively, how can you remain competitive defensively? That almost always starts at the point of attack and the big man on the floor. So that is sort of why those two are my key. But like I said, there's so many different ways that they can go that I think they have options. And it's just evaluating early in the season and then, pivoting off of that based on what you need.
We all silly like the mayor.